when I thought about sustainability on my own farm, and we started to transition our farm to organic back in 1976. And I want to be clear, that does not necessarily mean that because we transitioned it to organic that we were sustainable. Because one of the things I'm going to argue today is that just being organic does not automatically put you into the category of, or into the camp of sustainability. But we were concerned. We decided to transition our farm to organic. I didn't even know there was such a thing as an organic market in 1980 when we first started to qualify after 3 years of transition. We entered into that primarily because of a student of mine who actually introduced me to organic agriculture. His name was David Vetter, whom some of you may know. And what David helped me to understand, due to research that he did as a research assistant at the University of Nebraska, was what happened to the quality of soil when you managed land organically, and by real organic management, which pays attention to soil quality, as compared to when you simply manage it conventionally. And the difference was dramatic. And that impressed me so that when I went back to manage our farm back in 1976, I decided that that's what we were going to do. And I saw that purely in terms of a steady state situation. Here we had a farm. We had to figure out how to transition that farm to a different kind of farming that reduced our soil erosion, that reduced our impact on the environment, all of those things. It was very much a steady state kind of thing. We needed to make some changes, in effect, kind of green up the farm, if you will. Well, I want to argue that we're at a point now in our history when that concept of sustainability is no longer adequate. Simply greening up what we're doing is not going to get us to sustainability, because we are now moving into a future that has a series of very, very important challenges that are going to fundamentally change the way we all have to do things. And so now, instead of thinking of sustainability as a steady state concept, we have to think about it as a concept of resilience. Because we need to figure out systems, whether you're a farmer or running a business or whatever you're doing, we have to figure out a way to do that that has resilience built into the concept, because if we don't, then we're not going to be sustainable given the challenges that we're going to be facing. And the challenges, there are a number of them, and we can all come up with our own list. I have my own personal list of 10. But in terms of the immediate future, in my view, there are 4 big elephants in the room. The first of those is one that Gil has already mentioned, and that's energy. Our energy future now is going to be fundamentally different. We have to keep in mind that we have been operating all of our economies over the last 150 years with stored, concentrated energy. As Gil pointed out, energy never is created nor destroyed. That's the first law of thermodynamics. It's simply transformed from one form to another. And so the energy which we've been using over the last 100 years are hydrocarbons, which were stored through a series of unique events which took place on this planet, which created and stored oil and natural gas and coal underneath the Earth's surface. That's the energy that's driven our economy. Now, that's been an enormously efficient energy because it has been so readily available, because it was stored and concentrated. All we had to do was mine it and then process it, and it was available for us to use in our human economies. That era is now rapidly coming to a close. And if you want to have just a basic idea of how rapidly it's coming to a close, Chevron helped us with that in a series of ads which they ran in a number of our popular magazines across the country. And some of you may have seen them. They were a unique ad in that it was just a plain color background. The first one was a dark blue with just one simple sentence and then a simple question following it. The first one was, it took us 125 years to use the first trillion barrels of oil. We will use the next trillion in 30. And then the question is, so why should you care? Now, when I first saw this, I had to ask myself, now, why would an oil company spend money to put that kind of ad out there in magazines? And I think the simple answer is because they know they're not in the oil business, they're in the energy business. And they have to make that fundamental transition because the energy from oil, from stored concentrated energy, is now going to be a very, very short future because of the rate at which we're using it. It took us 125 years to use the first trillion barrel. We used the second trillion in 30. That puts us where? About 2030, 2035, and most of my colleagues that I've been talking to have been saying 2030, 2040 is really the basic cutoff point in terms of the way, and as we're going there, as we're headed in that direction, of course, the cost is going to rise dramatically. So, you know, when I hear our popular media in Iowa say, you know, we're going to produce corn ethanol and therefore we're going to wean ourselves from Mideast oil. You know, well, you know, it's all Mideast oil that's producing the corn, that's processing the ethanol, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, this is still a petroleum-based economy. And the real issue is that when you start transitioning from stored concentrated energy to current dispersed energy, which you first have to concentrate and then process, et cetera, then the energy that you get out for the energy in is simply so much lower. So it's the energy profit ratio that we have to really think about. So unless somebody comes up with a new kind of perpetual motion machine, and again, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that's not possible, there is not going to be a technological rescue for us to rescue our current economies and our current way of doing business when it comes to energy. We have to fundamentally redesign our systems to accommodate ourselves to our new energy future. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, well, just to quickly, the other two ads, which I thought were also equally interesting, one was put on an orange background. Again, simple statement with a simple question. Russia, Iran, and Qatar have 58% of the world's natural gas reserves. The US has 3%. So what does that mean for us? And then the third one was on a green background. Again, simple statement, simple question. Americans spend over $1 million on energy every minute. So who has the power to change that? And that's part of what we're here to talk about today. You know, who has the power to change that? And when it finally comes down to it, it's us. It's all of us. We have to figure out a way to do that. So energy is that first big elephant in the room that's going to fundamentally change the way we think about sustainability. We can no longer think about sustainability in terms of simply greening up what we're currently doing. We have to fundamentally think about how we redesign our systems so that they can function effectively under these new energy circumstances. The second energy in the room is water. Our current economy, and particularly true of our food and agriculture systems, has been enormously water consuming. You know, again, we have had enormous quantities of fresh water stored up in the Earth's surface in a similar way that we had enormous quantities of stored energy in our aquifers, et cetera, some of that going back to the Ice Age and beyond. And particularly in our food and agriculture system, we have been draining down our freshwater resources at an absolutely unsustainable rate. When you look at this, particularly on a global scale, and one of the things that the International Panel on Climate Change that Gil pointed out drew out for us is a map, and if you go on if you Google it, you can find it, a map of the areas on the planet where we have rain-fed agriculture, and they're very, very few. You know, it's the central United States, Brazil, Argentina, a couple of edges of China. You know, there are very, very few places on this planet where we are growing food with rain-fed agriculture. We grow our food almost entirely on this planet with irrigated agriculture. And China, as an example, as Lester Brown pointed out, about 80% of our grain production in China is dependent on irrigation. China is drawing down their groundwater resources at about 10 feet a year, some places already pumping from 1,000 feet deep. India, 60% of their grain production is dependent on irrigation. They're drawing down their groundwater in some places at the rate of 20 feet a year, and already some places pumping from 2,000 feet deep. Now imagine, you know, these are the two major population centers on our planet. How long can we continue to do that? But even in the United States, where only 1/5 of our grain production is dependent on irrigation, and I'm just talking about grain here at this point as one example, we still are drawing down the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the primary source of our irrigation water for the heartland. we're drawing down that at the rate of 1.3 trillion gallons of water faster each year than it can recharge. And already now have drawn it down by about half since 1960, when we started our industrial agriculture. We cannot continue to do this. And it's not just in the production, although 70% of our freshwater resources are used just for irrigation, for agricultural irrigation. Then we go into the processing, et cetera. And you and I, again, as Lester Brown has pointed out, we only need 4 liters of water to sustain our liquid needs, for our bodies. But we consume about 2,000 liters of water every day in terms of the food that we eat that's produced by our industrial methods, because of all of the water that's embedded in it. If you take an ordinary pound of boneless beefsteak, when you look at all of the water embedded to make that pound of boneless beefsteak available, including the water to raise the corn, the water that the animals drink, et cetera, there's about 2,000 gallons of water embedded in that single pound of boneless beefsteak. So when you see a truck going down the road with 40,000 pounds of boneless beefsteak, there's 80 million gallons of water embedded in that truck. We cannot continue to do this. This is not sustainable.